just wanted to share some thinking about what that means and some of the experiences I've had. So in terms of what I have learned, I think starting with a primary school that I visited in South London several times over recent years on regular occasions, I've been really struck by the one thing that children have told me there they really worry about most. Now, you might expect this is a group of 8 to 12-year-olds. You might expect that they're talking about their schoolwork or their exams. You might think that they'd be talking about their friendship groups or their peers, whether they're kind of seen to be popular and on trend, especially if they're avid social media users. But the one thing that they have told me that they worry about most, this group, is housing. Now, it's not difficult to see why that's the case when you dig a little into what their experience is and the experience of their families. This is a school which, of the 400 children on roll, 250 of those are deemed to be vulnerable. I should say at this point as well, when I asked how many had a social worker, actually only 8 of those 250 have a social worker. So you see the vast gap between those that are deemed vulnerable and those that are getting that, statutory help. You go into the school, it's a great school, very much part of the community. There are food banks, there's rows of clothes, there's toys. A room next door has washing machines. Their family support workers are there for families and will actually go along to their local housing office within the local authority to help them try and get the housing support they need. Because for many of those families, as their children know all too well, the problems with unsatisfactory and inappropriate housing are a day-to-day occurrence, and it dominates every aspect of their lives. Talking more to those children about what poor housing means to them and their experience of it, they often will talk about living in accommodation that's in a desperate state of repair. Some will say that it's infested and damp. These properties will quite often be on an estate waiting for demolition. Sometimes they're behind in their timescales. So it's unlikely to be upgraded as a result because that accommodation is about to come down. Many talk about feeling unsafe outside that flat, even scared to walk to school. One talked about being scared of a person down the landing who had threatened them with knives as a result of their own untreated mental health difficulties. And down the road in another estate in South London, their children talked about the day that they found a body in their play area because a resident had thrown themselves off the roof as they took their own life. Really tragic case. But again, part of the experience those children had, and again, someone suffering themselves from severe mental health conditions. And as someone once said to me, well, these are the lucky ones, these families, because actually they have been allocated housing. It might be inappropriate, might not be as we'd all wish to see fit, but they have been allocated housing. And one family attending that school was moved to temporary housing the other side of London. It took them an hour and a half to travel to school every day and the same to get home. And some of those families with no recourse to public funds, like the mother who walked into that school on a Monday morning with her children, completely tired and disheveled. She'd spent the weekend traveling and sleeping on a London bus because they had nowhere to live. A whole family sleeping on a bus route because they had nowhere else. So at the heart of all these experiences and stories is a chronic shortage of decent social housing. And I've seen this in many forms. We should remember that growing up in a stable, healthy, and secure home is so important for any child. Yet we know there are thousands of children in England who are living in poor accommodation or where families are homeless, stuck in poor quality temporary accommodation, often with low prospects of finding something different. And there are many others, of course, as well, that are at risk of ending up homeless. And such high levels of housing insecurity goes unseen, I think, by many of us, but it's at the heart of so many disadvantaged communities, and particular areas of entrenched poverty, deepening and exacerbating the challenges that those families face. I think that lockdown has given us a glimpse into what this means for children and families, and actually more of the general population. We now recognise what it's like to live in some of those situations. We're all in the same boat, was said during lockdown, but of course some are ocean liners and some are rafts, and leaky rafts at that. So these boats did look very different. For some children with roomy houses and a big garden, lockdown gave a rare opportunity to spend time with parents who are often working from home, with good access to broadband and plenty of room for quiet study. Compare that with the child living in a cramped one-bedroom flat, no outside space during lockdown. I was told about 4 siblings who lived in a one-bedroom flat. They shared the bed, whilst the parents, who were both working at home, one during the day, one during the night, try to rotate sleeping on the sofa or, going to sleep in the bed when the children were up. When they worked, they tried to speak very quietly as not to wake the other one. Little surprise that during lockdown that had a terrible impact on the family's mental health, and in fact led to a relationship breakup. And I think we just have to think, what family could survive that level of pressure? So the level of demand and shortage of accommodation, I think, also means that children frequently spend years living in temporary housing while their families wait for an offer of permanent accommodation. And a result of shortage of good quality self-contained temporary accommodation, many families have been placed in accommodation which is poor and too small. So during 2019, as Children's Commissioner, I published data showing that 120,000 children were living in temporary accommodation, with a further 90,000 sofa surfing. And a huge 585,000 children in families were homeless or at risk of homelessness. And of course, the label temporary is anything but that often. In 2017, around 4 in 10 children in temporary accommodation, that's around 50,000 children, had been there for at least 6 months. Around 1 in 20 had been there for at least a year. And there were particular concerns about particular types of housing, temporary housing, that I just wanted to highlight with you. Firstly, B&Bs, where sometimes the bathroom is shared and there's nowhere to cook. Places where vulnerable adults can be living on the same corridor, and the other residents might be families, but also might be vulnerable adults, such as those with mental health or drug abuse problems, creating sometimes intimidating and potentially unsafe environments for children. The office block conversion springing up in many parts. Individual flats, sometimes we're told the size of a parking space, the size of a taxi rank for the entire flat. The conversion of former office blocks and warehouses into temporary accommodation has been allowed under permitted development rights, and they bypass planning regulations and restrict the ability of local councils to object on the grounds of quality of accommodation. Other grounds trump the quality of accommodation. As I say, many of the flats are small, single studios shared by a whole family, with parents and children living and sleeping in the same single room, also containing their cooking facilities. There have also been areas suffering from crime and antisocial behaviour, and there are particular hotspots in some areas of the country. And then the converted shipping containers, hot in the summer, freezing in the winter. Often they're located on meanwhile sites, land that's earmarked for future development, but currently not in use. And the units are typically 1 or 2 bedroom and small in size, meaning that overcrowding can be a real issue. And as with some of the office block conversions, antisocial behaviour can also be a problem, leaving some parents worrying about letting their children out to play, and meaning those children have to stay inside in cramped conditions instead. And the risks associated with some of this temporary housing can reduce some of the most basic aspects of childhood. One child told me, "We have to eat on the floor as there's not enough space. When we sleep," another said, "water drips on us," which we don't like. Several children and parents spoke about the cramped, overcrowding conditions, particularly in B&Bs where families would be sharing that room, which leave little room for furniture and possessions, let alone space for children to be able to play. The school holidays can be challenging as families lack space outside or are reluctant to let their children out to play. And the accommodation may be miles away from friends and family parks or leisure facilities. And even if activities are nearby, often those prices can be prohibitive. A teenage boy described living in a hotel for 8 months alongside sex workers. We spoke with children who are spending hours every day having to go to and from school because they've been housed so far away from home and where they were taught. The example of the family in South London. Others told us that being homeless can lead to bullying and cause stress and tensions within their family. These are the children in families that are trapped by increasing rents and an unforgiving system. It's a cycle that many families, as so many of you will know, cannot break out of. And I think there is something very wrong in our housing system when children are growing up in B&Bs, shipping containers, and old office blocks. And such a shortage of good, safe housing, I think, has, of course, such a profound effect on the most vulnerable children and families. And that includes those that are in care and care leavers. And when I meet children in care, I'm really constantly struck by their strengths, their talents, their resilience. But often these are vulnerable children who've had to cope with incredibly difficult situations alone. And perhaps because of this, they often seem much older than their years. But what can be so forgotten when meeting these children is that they are just that, they are children. However independent they may seem, these are teenagers just like any others who need care, attention from adults if their family are unable to provide it. And unfortunately, what I've seen is that the care system, the way it's organised, often doesn't fully reflect this. Some children in care, particularly older teens, who are vulnerable, are not placed with foster carers or in children's homes. They end up in what is known as unregulated accommodation. This is independent or semi-independent accommodation with limited support. And it's not regulated by the Quality Inspectorate. It's under particular scrutiny at the moment, and new regulations that go some of the way, but certainly not all of the way, are currently being devised. What's common in all types of unregulated accommodations, the vulnerable child placed there isn't entitled to care, where they'd be closely supervised around the clock, but to support, which means that support staff may check in to see if they're okay, or may have a support package. But it does mean that they have limited support. And again, recognising that these are some of the most vulnerable children. The research I carried out showed that 1 in 8 children in care spent some time in unregulated placements in 2018 to 19. And the number is increasing partly as a result of the lack of capacity in children's homes. And in some cases, what I think is an outdated belief that children aged just 16 should be ready to become independent. Concerned for the safety and well-being of these children, I decided to look more closely at some of their experiences, to hear from those children themselves about what life is sometimes like in unregulated accommodation, and to examine what needs to change for them. It's not the case for all unregulated provision by any means, but some children did tell me of accommodation in desperate need of repair. Again, of being frightened and intimidated by gangs and groups of adults drinking, taking drugs and hanging around the flats, sometimes living in the same accommodation unit. At least one police force has spoken about accommodation that is rife with organised crime, with vulnerable residents intimidated and groomed into taking and selling drugs. And just pause a moment there to really note the similarities. Vulnerable people placed in accommodation that is high risk and insecure, that increases their vulnerability rather than providing the safety and security they need. And a further concern are the 1 in 4 care leavers who we know will leave care to become homeless, often a result of a toxic combination of a cliff edge of care support, of financial difficulties and debt. And this, as you will know, has been sadly a reality for too many care leavers in the past. But it is an area where there are some moves, and there are some green shoots of change that I just wanted to share with you. A growing number of local authorities are now in England are now exempting care leavers from council tax until 21 or 25 in a bid to reduce debt. This is something that I was promoting very much as when I was Children's Commissioner, and charities such as Children's Society were being very strong on this too, because what we found was, there were care leavers who were being sent bills for council tax that were quite substantial, that didn't know what they were, didn't know if they had to pay them, and where the follow-up in terms of the demands for the money were robust and fast, and often those young people would end up in debt. Very good that they're being exempt from council tax. There's been a positive movement on the rate of housing allowance to reflect the fact that these young people have no recourse to parents for financial support. There are examples now where some local authorities are building new flats and accommodation for care leavers, and organisations such as Centrepoint also building new accommodation for care leavers to rent, to be able to stay there for the long term, to look at even purchasing over time as they constantly build new accommodation for those care leavers too. And then examples such as plans from the national charity Oasis to take a similar approach to accommodation for young people who are leaving custody. And we know that the lack of accommodation for some of those young people is one of the reasons why 69% of those young people leaving custody reoffend over the first year. Staggeringly, almost a quarter of those in the first month. So as part of the charity's development of a new model for custody, a secure school, they'll also be developing a new network of accommodation and support for those leaving custody, where they will be able to plan and get support over time, starting in Medway, where the first secure school will be, and then looking to expand around the country. So these are positive developments, and if they're continued and extended, I do think they could mark a step change in security and opportunity for care leavers. New government funding has also been made available to help support some children to stay longer with carers, and a smaller amount to target care leavers at particular risk of homelessness. The scale of change needed is, of course, immense. And for care leavers and for families, good affordable housing will require ambition, funding, and a long-term priority. So as we move into the next stage, hopefully, and move out of the pandemic, what does that mean? Well, as with so many of the social policy issues, I do think there is an opportunity now to look again at what is needed in terms of good quality accommodation. And what that means in terms of housing, I think, as much as the slogan says, build back better, but this time, literally. I do think the experience of the pandemic and increased understanding of the prevalence and impact of insecure and poor housing means that the crisis of family homelessness can no longer be ignored. So what would it take not only to improve the state of temporary accommodation for families who need it, but reduce the number of families becoming homeless in the first place, and ultimately to improve the outcomes for very vulnerable children? So some basic starting points, I think. The first, I think that government needs to focus specifically on understanding what the impact of insecure housing and homelessness is on children and families. In its policy work on this, it's broad. It doesn't focus enough, and I think it should. And of course, understanding and monitoring the scale and nature of homelessness will be vital to inform priorities, but also interventions. So it really should be a priority within housing policy itself. Secondly, I think there needs to be proactive work locally, as we've seen in some areas, but less so in others, to develop and manage the housing market for families and ensure there's better joined up working to share data to ensure that children and families get the maximum support possible and ensure they don't fall through the gaps in the system. And that would include schools, include GPs, with training to help professionals spot the signs of homelessness and be able to respond. Thirdly, strengthen the safety net. So actually the gaps in welfare income that lead to rent arrears are avoided, and evictions that may happen as a result also avoided. And then fund and reform local authority housing systems so they're able to improve their housing stock and revitalise their localities. But of course, building back better really does mean embarking on an ambitious and radical programme of building to change the face of social housing. And this is the real scale change to move to a different stage of ambition. What a shift that could be. New expectations of child-family, a friendly family accommodation, well-managed, tenant-inclusive housing estates, well-supported environment backed up by good connected services. I'm really struck by, you talk to so many families who are planning to start a family certainly in parts of London, and they will flock to the areas of London where they have the facilities, where it's seen as being child friendly. They're often called nappy valleys. There's lots of other families that have young children, there's open spaces, there's good schools, there's good support. You don't get any of that if you're struggling to get even on the housing ladder or temporary accommodation. There is no sense that you have any choice within that, or that child-friendly accommodation could be something that can have any expectation of. And we also know that terribly in some of those areas that actually public services have huge gaps and can be the worst. So the worst of all worlds where. But I think the pandemic has shown what we can do as a country when we put our mind to it. We've had the vaccination program, we've had the furlough scheme. So I say let's draw on the experience of modern aspirational social housing in other countries, and let's see what we can do with investment and will, rather than be held back by what we can't do and the enormity of the task. I think it really is time to understand the importance of housing security in all our lives and commit to making it a reality for everyone.